There are moments in life that seem ordinary, but fate has a way of unraveling extraordinary truths. The day Sarah Richardson was to walk down the aisle, the sun broke through the clouds in Pine Ridge, a quaint little town tucked away in the heart of Vermont. The white chapel sat atop a green hill, its bell tower rising proudly against the blue sky. Pine Ridge was the sort of place where life moved slowly, where everybody knew everybody, and secrets rarely survived the weight of whispered conversations. The wedding was the talk of the town for months. Sarah, a 28-year-old kindergarten teacher with honey blonde hair and a heart that seemed too big for her frame, had always been adored. Her laughter echoed like wind chimes through classrooms and coffee shops alike, and she had a way of making people feel seen. It was no surprise that when she became engaged to Matthew Parker, Pine Ridge's golden boy and successful realtor, it seemed like a fairy tale written in real life. Their love story was the sort of thing locals gushed about over pie at Millie's Diner. Two perfect souls, intertwined. Sarah's dog Maggie was perhaps the only other love of her life. A 6-year-old Labrador retriever with soulful amber eyes and a fur coat that glowed like fresh wheat under the sun, Maggie had been Sarah's shadow since her college years. Maggie had seen Sarah through everything: late nights of heartbreak, first days at work, and cozy weekends curled up in their small but charming cottage by the woods. If anyone knew Sarah's secrets, it was Maggie. The morning of the wedding arrived with a hum of excitement. Inside the chapel, friends and family squeezed into polished wooden pews, sharing smiles and occasional tissues. Matthew stood nervously at the altar in a tailored gray suit, running a hand through his dark hair. Outside, Sarah stood alone for a moment, smoothing down the white lace of her dress. Her bouquet of ivory roses trembled slightly in her hands. Her mother fussed nearby, tears already streaking mascara, and bridesmaids adjusted their pastel dresses as the wedding march loomed closer. And there was Maggie, tail wagging, panting in the June heat, her collar adorned with a small garland of white daisies. Sarah, ever the unconventional bride, insisted Maggie be her companion on the walk down the aisle. "She's family," Sarah had said. Everyone laughed, but it felt right. Sarah wouldn't take this step without Maggie by her side. With a deep breath, Sarah took Maggie's leash and prepared for the moment. "Let's do this, girl," she whispered, more to herself than the dog. The music began, soft, sweet notes from a piano floating through the air. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she stepped toward the chapel doors. Her father reached for her hand, ready to escort her down the aisle. But it was then, right there, on the gravel path, that Maggie did something strange. She stopped. "Maggie," Sarah hissed, tugging the leash gently. But the dog refused to move. She sniffed the ground, turning her head curiously, before suddenly darting to the left, her leash slipping from Sarah's grasp. Gasps echoed from the guests who had turned to watch. Sarah's face flushed. "Maggie, come back," she called, panic bubbling in her voice. The Labrador had scrambled a few feet away toward a bush near the chapel steps. Sarah hurried after her, the hem of her gown catching on small stones. "What's gotten into you?" she muttered, crouching down as Maggie pawed at the dirt and leaves. And then she saw it. A credit card, half buried in the soil, its shiny plastic surface glinting under the sun. Maggie nosed it insistently, whining softly as though urging Sarah to look closer. Sarah frowned. A credit card here? Who could have lost it? Carefully she picked it up, brushing off the dirt. But as she read the name embossed in gold letters, her heart dropped. Matthew Parker. Her fiancé's name. Sarah froze. A sinking feeling began clawing its way through her chest. Why was Matthew's card here, hidden in the bushes outside the chapel? Her hand trembled as she stared at it, questions swirling violently in her mind. Maggie sat beside her, watching her intently, as if she knew what her owner had just stumbled upon. "Sarah?" Her father's voice broke through her haze. He had come back to see what the commotion was about. "Is everything all right?" She looked up, swallowing hard. The music still played faintly in the background, but the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. She forced a smile, slipping the card into the folds of her bouquet. "It's nothing, Dad. Maggie just got distracted." But as she allowed her father to guide her back toward the chapel doors, her thoughts spiraled wildly. Why would Matthew's credit card be buried in dirt, as though someone had tried to hide it? And who had hidden it? Maggie trotted at her side, leash back in Sarah's hand, but the Labrador's usual enthusiasm was replaced with a strange, solemn calm, her eyes fixed on Sarah as if to say, "You're not done yet." As the doors opened and Sarah stepped into the chapel, the music swelled. Rows of smiling faces turned to greet her, and Matthew, standing tall and expectant at the altar, met her gaze with a radiant smile. To everyone else, it was a perfect moment. But in Sarah's mind, nothing was the same anymore. Maggie's discovery weighed heavy in her hand, her fingers brushing against the hidden credit card in her bouquet. Her heart pounded as she took each step down the aisle, forcing her smile to remain intact. What had Maggie uncovered? And what did it mean for the perfect life she had been about to begin? Sarah's steps echoed through the chapel, the gentle swish of her gown in rhythm with the piano's notes, the perfect image of a blushing bride. And yet, behind her smile, a storm raged. The credit card in her bouquet felt heavier with each step, like a brick in her hand. Matthew stood at the altar, smiling his charming, easy smile, the same smile that had won her heart years ago. But now, all Sarah could see was the golden lettering on that card and the dirt clinging to its edges. Maggie's find gnawed at her mind. It didn't make sense. The ceremony proceeded as if nothing had happened. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, and the congregation erupted in applause as the newlyweds were declared husband and wife. Matthew kissed her tenderly, and Sarah tried to feel the joy she had imagined for this day. Maggie was waiting outside the chapel doors when they emerged, her leash held by Sarah's friend Julia. The dog's amber eyes locked onto Sarah immediately, tail wagging half-heartedly. Something about Maggie's expression, the strange solemnity, sent a chill through Sarah. Maggie knew something Sarah didn't. The reception was held at a nearby barn-turned-event space, a rustic venue wrapped in twinkle lights and draped with wildflowers. Guests mingled beneath its vaulted wooden beams, laughter spilling out like music into the evening air. Matthew was the center of attention, toasting with his groomsmen, shaking hands and dancing with Sarah on the polished wooden floor. "You're quiet tonight," Matthew murmured, holding her close as they swayed to the soft hum of an old country ballad. Sarah forced a smile, her cheek brushing against his, just taking it all in. But her mind raced. Between dances and speeches, her gaze kept flickering toward Maggie, curled up beneath one of the guest tables. The dog's leash was tied to a chair, but she sat alert, watching Matthew with an intensity Sarah couldn't ignore. "Stop it," she scolded herself. "You're being paranoid." But then Julia approached with a glass of wine, grinning. "I've got to say, you and Matthew look picture perfect tonight." Sarah smiled weakly, taking a sip. "Thanks, Jules." Julia leaned in conspiratorially. "You know, I actually saw Matthew near the chapel early this morning. He looked a little frazzled. Must have been nerves, huh?" Sarah froze mid-sip. "Near the chapel?" "Yeah, around the back by the bushes. I thought maybe he was just getting some air before the big moment. You know, men and their cold feet," Julia joked, rolling her eyes. Sarah's chest tightened. The bushes, where Maggie had found the card. She excused herself quickly, weaving through guests to find Maggie. The Labrador's ears perked up as Sarah knelt down beside her, her heart hammering. "Maggie," Sarah whispered, stroking the dog's fur absently. "What's going on, girl? What are you trying to tell me?" Maggie tilted her head, whining softly, her nose bumping Sarah's hand. And then Sarah noticed it. There was something tucked into Maggie's collar, a folded slip of paper. Frowning, Sarah glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then carefully slid the note free. The paper was crumpled and stained, as though it had been discarded carelessly. Unfolding it with trembling hands, she read, "You deserve to know the truth. Check under the oak tree." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Under the oak tree? She looked at Maggie, who was staring at her expectantly, as if the note had been meant for her all along. The oak tree stood on the edge of the property, its ancient limbs stretching toward the darkening sky. Fireflies flickered around its base as Sarah approached, her heels sinking into the soft grass. Maggie trotted alongside her, leash clutched tightly in Sarah's fist. The reception's music echoed faintly in the distance, but here, beneath the vast tree, it felt like another world. She scanned the ground, her heart pounding, until her gaze fell on a small patch of freshly disturbed earth. Maggie darted forward, pawing at it eagerly. With her pulse roaring in her ears, Sarah dropped to her knees, digging carefully with her hands. The dirt was loose and cool against her fingertips. Within moments, she unearthed a small black box. Sarah's breath hitched. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a stack of papers, crumpled receipts, notes, and to her horror, photographs. Her eyes scanned the first picture, her stomach lurching violently. It was Matthew, in a hotel room, his arm draped casually around the shoulders of a woman Sarah didn't recognize, dark-haired and smiling. The date on the back of the photo was just 3 weeks ago. "No," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. She shuffled through the papers, each one worse than the last. Hotel receipts, dinner reservations, another credit card statement, but this one wasn't hers. It was all there, a secret life laid bare in black and white. The truth hit her like a fist to the chest. Matthew had been cheating on her. For how long? She couldn't be sure. But there was no mistaking it now. Maggie sat beside her, panting softly, as if waiting for Sarah to process what she had uncovered. Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she cradled the evidence in her lap, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Her wedding day. The day that was supposed to be the happiest of her life. And yet, here she was, beneath an oak tree, her dog by her side, her entire world unraveling. And it had been Maggie who stopped her. Maggie who knew. Sarah looked at the Labrador through tear-streaked eyes. "You saved me, girl," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved me from him." Maggie licked her hand gently, her amber eyes full of quiet understanding. But now, Sarah had a choice to make, one that would determine the rest of her life. Sarah sat beneath the oak tree, clutching the damning evidence against Matthew as though it were a lifeline. The reception music drifted faintly in the distance, a cruel reminder of the world she'd left behind just moments ago. Around her, the night felt impossibly quiet, the only sound the faint hum of crickets and the soft panting of Maggie at her side. Her tears had stopped, though her chest still heaved with the weight of betrayal. The photographs, the receipts, it was all so clear, so undeniable. He wasn't who I thought he was. Matthew's smile, his promises, the shared dreams, they were lies. And yet here she was, his wife. A word that now tasted bitter on her tongue. Maggie whined softly and nuzzled Sarah's arm. The Labrador's amber eyes were filled with an almost human understanding, as though she could feel the war raging inside her owner's heart. Sarah looked down at the dog and wiped her face with trembling hands. "I don't know what to do, girl," she whispered, her voice cracking. "How did this happen? How did I let this happen?" Maggie let out a small bark as if urging her to stand, to move. But move where? Go back to the reception? Confront Matthew in front of everyone she knew? Her mother, her friends, all the guests who had cheered for their union, they'd see their perfect fairy tale explode into pieces. The humiliation clawed at her. But then again, was that worse than living a lie? Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. The memories of their courtship flashed before her like scenes from a movie. Matthew bringing her flowers after work, the nights they'd spent curled on the couch planning their future. Were those lies too, or had it been real once, before it crumbled into this betrayal? Slowly she stood. Her hands gripped the black box of evidence tightly as Maggie followed, ever loyal, ever watchful. The soft earth gave beneath her heels as she turned toward the barn where the reception was still in full swing. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed into the night, mingling with the faint glow of the twinkle lights strung through the rafters. Her feet felt heavy, but she forced herself to walk. One step at a time. I deserve better. I deserve the truth. The barn doors loomed in front of her, their large wooden frames glowing softly in the warm light pouring out from within. Through the open doorway, Sarah could see Matthew laughing with his groomsmen, a glass of champagne in hand. He looked so natural, so comfortable, like a man with nothing to hide. Sarah's fists tightened around the box. The anger that had been simmering inside her now roared like a bonfire. But she didn't walk through the front doors. Instead, she turned and quietly slipped around to the back of the barn, where the night air was cool and still. Maggie padded beside her, her tail low as if sensing what was to come. There, beneath the low light of a single bulb, Matthew leaned against the wooden siding of the barn, talking on his phone. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. "I'll call you tomorrow," Matthew was saying softly, his voice smooth but urgent. "No, I can't talk now. I just need to get through tonight." "Okay, I'll take care of it, I promise." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. He's talking to her. Maggie let out a low, guttural growl that startled Matthew, making him glance sharply toward the sound. When his eyes landed on Sarah, standing there with Maggie and the black box in her hands, his face paled. "Sarah," quickly shoving his phone into his pocket. "Who was that?" Sarah's voice was calm, too calm, though it trembled at the edges. Matthew pushed off the wall and tried to smile, but it faltered under her piercing gaze. "Babe, what are you doing out here? Everyone's waiting." "Who was that, Matthew?" she repeated, her voice louder this time. Maggie stepped forward, her stance protective. Matthew's eyes darted to the black box in her hands, realization sinking in. "Where did you get that?" "Where do you think?" Sarah snapped. Her voice cracked as tears threatened to return, but she held them back. "Why, Matthew? Why did you do this?" "Sarah, you don't understand." "No, you don't get to say that," she shot back, her voice rising with every word. "I trusted you. I believed every word you said to me, every promise. And the whole time, you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Her throat was too tight. Matthew ran a hand through his hair, sighing heavily. "It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think." Sarah's voice broke now, her anger giving way to raw, aching pain. "You've been lying to me, to everyone, and if it weren't for Maggie—" Her voice faltered as she looked at the Labrador sitting beside her, silent and steadfast. "If it weren't for her, I would have never known." Matthew's gaze dropped to Maggie. "It's a dog, Sarah. You're letting a dog—" "Don't," she hissed, her eyes blazing. "Don't you dare." She knew something was wrong. "She saved me, Matthew. She saved me from you." For a moment, the two of them stared at each other in silence. The truth hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Matthew opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. Sarah took a step back, her chest heaving. "I'm done," she said quietly, though her voice was firm. "I don't care what everyone in there thinks. I don't care what they say. I'm not going back in there and pretending you're the man I thought you were." Matthew stepped forward, desperation flickering across his face. "Sarah, please." But Maggie barked sharply, stepping between them as if to say enough. Sarah met Matthew's gaze one last time. "Goodbye, Matthew." Then she turned, walking away from him, away from the barn, away from the lies. Maggie walked proudly beside her, her tail wagging as though she knew her owner had just done the hardest, bravest thing of her life. The reception lights grew dimmer behind them as Sarah wiped her tears and held her head high. She didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain: she wasn't alone. Maggie was with her, her protector, her constant, her quiet hero. "Thank you, girl," she whispered as they stepped into the dark, open field beyond the barn. Maggie looked up at her, amber eyes shining with love. It was Maggie who had stopped her. Maggie who had uncovered the truth. And Maggie who, in the end, had saved Sarah's life. The night air clung to Sarah like a heavy blanket as she walked away from the barn, the twinkle lights dimming behind her. She felt raw, stripped of the life she had thought was hers. But there was something else, too, beneath the ache in her chest. Clarity. The truth had been ugly, but it had set her free. Maggie trotted quietly beside her, her leash slack in Sarah's hand. The Labrador moved with a quiet pride, as though she knew her job was done, that she had led Sarah to safety. Every step forward felt lighter than the last, as though the weight of Matthew's lies was slowly peeling away. Sarah let the tears come now, silent, steady, each one washing away a piece of her pain. When they reached the cottage, the small house Sarah had loved and built into a home over the years, she paused at the front steps. She hadn't realized how much she had missed its warmth. "This is mine," she thought, her fingers brushing the doorknob. This house, this life, this freedom. It had all seemed so small before, so insignificant next to the dreams Matthew had sold her. But now, it was everything. Inside, she slipped out of her wedding gown, the fabric pooling on the floor like a ghost of the woman she'd been hours before. Maggie sat at the foot of the bed, watching Sarah quietly as she pulled on an old sweatshirt and pajama pants. For the first time that day, Sarah exhaled deeply, as though she had been holding her breath for months. She sat down on the edge of the bed and patted the spot beside her. Maggie didn't hesitate. The Labrador hopped up and curled against her side, her head resting in Sarah's lap. Sarah's hands found her fur, soft and familiar, and she buried her face in Maggie's neck. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. Maggie let out a small sigh, her body relaxing into Sarah's touch. It felt strange, this quiet. Her house had always been filled with Matthew's voice, Matthew's plans. But now it was only hers. She looked down at Maggie and whispered, "It's just you and me, girl. And you know what? That's enough." Maggie's tail thumped softly against the bed. The days that followed were the hardest Sarah had ever faced. Pine Ridge was small and news traveled fast. By the time the sun rose the next morning, word had spread. The wedding had fallen apart, and Sarah Richardson had left Matthew Parker. The details were unclear to everyone but Sarah, and she intended to keep it that way. At the grocery store, neighbors offered sympathetic smiles and careful words. At the school where she taught, co-workers brought coffee to her desk, their kindness both comforting and overwhelming. The whispers followed her, but Sarah learned to tune them out. At night, when the house grew too quiet, Maggie was there, her shadow, her comfort. When Sarah cried, Maggie rested her head in her lap. When Sarah sat on the back porch, staring at the woods and wondering what came next, Maggie would lean against her leg, as if to say, "We'll figure it out." And slowly, Sarah did. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, Sarah found herself walking with Maggie through the same chapel grounds where everything had fallen apart. The summer air was thick with the hum of insects, and the gravel path crunched softly beneath their feet. Sarah stopped beneath the old oak tree, the place where she had found the truth. It felt different now, less ominous. She looked at the earth where the box had been buried and let out a slow breath. "This tree used to feel like the end of everything," she murmured. Maggie looked up at her, tail swishing. Sarah smiled faintly, crouching to scratch behind the dog's ears. "But maybe it's where everything really started, huh?" The Labrador barked softly, as if in agreement. Sarah rose and let her gaze sweep over the chapel in the distance. She could hear faint laughter coming from inside, another couple celebrating their future, hopeful and unburdened. It hurt a little, but there was no bitterness. Sarah had begun to see the truth for what it was. Not a punishment, but a gift. Matthew's betrayal had shattered her, but it had also saved her. It had pulled her out of a lie before she could spend the rest of her life living it. And Maggie, sweet, loyal Maggie, had been the one to lead her there. Months passed. Summer turned to autumn, and the leaves around Pine Ridge burned gold and crimson. Sarah threw herself into her teaching, her students bringing her the joy she thought she'd lost. She spent evenings curled up with Maggie by the fire, reading books and sipping tea, rediscovering the pieces of herself that she had let slip away during her years with Matthew. One crisp October afternoon, she took Maggie to the local shelter's adoption event to volunteer. Maggie, of course, was the star of the day, her gentle demeanor and warm amber eyes drawing people in. "You're lucky," an older woman said to Sarah, watching Maggie patiently let a child tug at her ears. "Not every dog would have done what she did." Sarah smiled, kneeling beside Maggie to kiss the top of her head. "She's my hero," she said softly. "She saved me." Maggie turned to lick Sarah's cheek, tail wagging happily. That night, as Sarah lay in bed with Maggie curled beside her, she realized something. She was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. She had survived the worst day of her life. She had faced the truth and walked through the fire. And though she still didn't have all the answers, she knew she was strong enough to build something better. "Thank you, girl," she whispered into the quiet. Maggie snored softly in response, her body warm and steady against Sarah's side. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling peace for the first time in months. The truth had nearly broken her, but Maggie had guided her through it, one step at a time, and for that she would be grateful forever. Months turned into years, and Sarah's life took on a quiet beauty she never imagined possible. She remained in Pine Ridge, her small cottage becoming a sanctuary of peace and growth. The walls no longer echoed with uncertainty, but with laughter, her own, shared with friends and her students, who filled her days with purpose. Maggie remained by her side, her constant companion and silent protector, aging gracefully but still carrying that same spark of devotion in her amber eyes. Sarah often reflected on the day of her almost wedding. The memory was no longer jagged and raw, but a lesson etched into her heart. It was Maggie who had sensed the truth before anyone else. Maggie who had refused to let her walk blind into a life built on lies. That day hadn't been the end. It had been a beginning. A painful one, yes, but one that set her free. In time, the whispers around town faded. Matthew's betrayal became a distant shadow, not forgotten but forgiven. Not for him, but for herself. She learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about honoring the strength it took to survive it. One crisp morning, Sarah sat on the front steps of her cottage, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, and Maggie resting at her feet. The Labrador's fur had grayed around her muzzle, her movements slower than before, but her eyes still gleamed with that same love and wisdom. Sarah looked down at her and smiled softly. "You saved my life, you know that?" she said. Maggie thumped her tail against the porch in response, as if to say, "I know." And Sarah believed it. Because heroes don't always wear capes or come with grand gestures. Sometimes they come with wet noses, wagging tails, and an unshakable instinct to protect the ones they love. Sarah looked out at the golden horizon. The world bathed in morning light and breathed in deeply. She had survived, she had healed, and most importantly, she had found herself again, all because a dog refused to let her settle for less than the truth. "Come on, girl," she said, standing up and patting her thigh. "Let's go see what today has in store for us." Maggie rose to her feet, her tail wagging as she followed Sarah into the world. Two souls walking side by side, unbroken and free. Final message: sometimes the truth comes to us in the most unexpected ways. Sarah's story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, there are glimmers of hope, and sometimes they come in the form of a loyal friend who refuses to let us fall. Heroes, after all, come in all shapes and sizes, and love has a way of saving us when we need it most. Never underestimate the quiet power of the ones who stand by your side. Sometimes they're the angels you didn't know you needed.